Dear colleagues, let me present our research modeling the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services by authors Tatiana Hovorushchenko, Elizaveta Hnatchuk, Khmelnytsky National University, and our Herts, Ivan Franko, National University of Lviv. Today, medical technologies must meet four requirements: efficiency, safety, novelty, and economic benefits. The modern therapist makes the decision integrating several medical specialties. This solution is a daily problem, especially when using innovative medical technologies. With the introduction of insurance medicine in Ukraine, every therapist should know the standards of diagnosis and especially the standards of treatment of therapeutic diseases, as failure to comply with the standards of treatment can lead to complaints of patients, legal conflicts, and compensation of considerable financial resource at the expense of the doctor. In view of the above, the issue of concluding a contract for the provision of therapeutic services needs increasing attention today. A contract for the provision of therapeutic services can be defined as an arrangement whereby one party provider undertakes on the task of the other party customer with complying the healthcare legislation to provide a service of a therapeutic nature, and the customer agrees to pay the contractor the specified service unless otherwise specified by contract of law. Successfully implemented medical software, the decision support systems can greatly increase the productivity of therapists. Even more significant and important to support the work of therapists are multidisciplinary medical decision support systems, which are being developed at the intersection of the medical and other subject areas. For example, the decision support system for medical law, which would support decision-making on concluding contracts for the provision of therapeutic services, taking into account legislative grounds. So today the actual task is to develop an intelligent decision support system for the civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. Part of the material of the civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services provided by the author of the article, Dr. Science Alan Herts. The review and analysis of known decision support systems for the medical law are represented third and fourth slides. This review has proven that none of these known decision support systems is intended to support decision-making on concluding contracts for the provision of therapeutic services, taking into account legislative grounds. So today it is necessary to develop an intelligent decision support system for the civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. For that, the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services should first be organized, which is the goal of the research. This paper is devoted to, in particular, modeling the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. The text of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services should include the section General Terms and Main Part. The General Terms section consists of the following clauses: a subject of the contract, theoretical principle of works, practical tools, limits of competence of the practitioners, duties, rights, and responsibilities of the doctor, medical institution, duties, rights, and responsibilities of the client, price of services and procedure of payments, timing and schedule of services, possible manifestations of concomitant and incidental adverse effects of exposure to therapeutic services. Other conditions. The main part section of the contract may include the following units. Unit 1, diagnostic search. Unit 2, making the diagnosis. And Unit 3, purpose of treatment. In the previous research, the authors have argued that information of the subject area, including the area of medical law, is advisable to submit as ontologies that allow for systematic and repeat analysis of this information. The other paper presents the concept of the decision-making process in the field of legal regulation of surrogate motherhood. A similar approach can be used in the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. For decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services, an ideal ontology is needed, which will represent the necessary ideal structure, section, units, clauses of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services in terms of civil law regulation. For each case, the conclusion of a contract for the provision of therapeutic services will require of real ontology. This will contain the real structure of the real contract. Comparison of the real ontology with the ideal ontology makes it possible to determine the presence of the necessary points in the real contract for the provision of therapeutic services and to decide accordingly on the correctness or incorrectness of the structure in the contract. Let AP in the set of missing clauses in the contract for the provision of therapeutic service are present on first slide. At the requirement of the interviewed experts in the field of medical law, considering the obligation to guarantee by such a contract of the safety of services in therapy for the patient, for the conclusion of the contract, for the provision of therapeutic services, it is mandatory to perform all the above points. Therefore, taking into account the theory described in previous research, the criterion of the correctness of the structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic service has the next form. Considering for the filling of an ideal ontology set, theoretical and ontological models are required. In addition, given the present criterion of the correctness of the structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services, it is necessary to develop a model of the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. Considering the above requirements to the structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services, we will present this contract in the following formalized second form. General terms section consists of a number of clauses and can be presented in the following theoretical form. Third. Main part section consists of 3 units and can be represented as a cortege. Third. Unit 1, diagnostic search, should contain a number of clauses that can be formalized in the following set theoretical form. First. Unit 2, making the diagnosis, also should contain a number of clauses that can be formalized in the following set theoretical form. 6. Clinical diagnosis consists of many clauses. 7. Unit 3, purpose of treatment, involves formulating and prescribing adequate treatment, which consists of the following clauses. 8. Then the model of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services with the ideal structure in terms on civil law regulation has the following Form 9. Considering formalization form of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services with the ideal structure in terms of civil law regulation and relation between concept influence the decision models of the ideal ontology of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services can be represented in the form 10. Taking into account the development criterion for the correctness of the structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services and the model of the ideal ontology of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services, let's conduct modeling the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. If is the set of missing clauses in the contract for the provision of therapeutic services, then 11, the procedure rules for decision on the correctness or incorrectness of the structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services is represented on 8th slide. The development models are used to systematize the information obtained from the contract for the provision of therapeutic services and bring into a general form in accordance with the civil law of Ukraine, so it is advisable to develop such models in static set theoretical form. The developed set theoretical models are the basis for modeling the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. The process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contract for the provision of treatment services regarding the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure is presented on slide 2. The proposed process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services is an iterative process based on the comparison. Experiment results and discussions are present on 9th slide. The analysis of the real contract for the provision of therapeutic services ready to be signed by the parties using the developed model on the decision-making process on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services should set the set. So are no clauses particular tools identifying individual symptoms on the DCS based on complaints, previous syndromic diagnosis, optimal physical, diet, and hygiene requirements. In the prepared contract, the signatories were informed that structure of contract for the provision of therapeutic services is incorrect, with providing the information about the absent clauses of the contract and were invited to revise the contract. The contract was revised. The contract was reanalyzed using the developed model, which resulted in the set, thus concluding structure of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services is correct, followed by singlet the contract. The developed set theoretical model of the ideal ontology of the contract for the provision or therapeutic services, model of the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services, provided the possibility to perform a fast check of the contracts for the provision of therapeutic services concerning the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure in terms of civil law regulation. Such check allows making automatically, without human participation, unmistakable decisions about the correctness and incorrectness of the structure of the contract, the possibility or impossibility of concluding the contract, and significantly improves the efficiency of the therapist's work and insurance medicine, as well as can protect both patients and doctors. The described example provides the workability and efficiency of the developed model of the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts. Currently, there is need in Ukraine to develop a decision support system on civil law regulation of contract for the provision of therapeutic services, which can significantly improve the effectiveness of the therapist work and ensures medicine, as well as can protect both patients and doctors. First, the theoretical models and the model of the ideal of the contract for the provision of therapeutic services based on the ideal structure of the contract from the point of view of civil law regulation has been developed. These models make it possibility the model in the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services regarding the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure. Second, the model of the process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services concerning the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure is first time developed. This model is based on a comparative analysis of ontologies. The developed models reflects the features of decision-making regarding the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure. Such a model is the theoretical basis for the development of methods and decision support system on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic service regarding the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure. The perspective direction of future authors' work are the development of the model in ideal ontology, the development of the decision-making method and evolution of its effectiveness, and realization of the ontology-based decision support system as a part of intelligent information technology on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services regarding the correctness or incorrectness of the contract structure on the basis of the proposed model of process of decision-making on civil law regulation of contracts for the provision of therapeutic services. Successful implementation of the proposed decision support system can greatly increase the productivity of therapists by support decision-making on concluding contracts for the provision of therapeutic services, taking into account legislative grounds. Thanks for attention.